Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are once again going to be continuing our educational speedrun series. I appreciate all the comments and positivity that you guys have given thus far.
Zooming through the game with the bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Night on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey hey, he's smurfing play by play, beats you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, eagles meet defeat. Just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. We're going to start playing another game of 10 minutes with 0-second increment, and we get to move 1 to e4. Now I've spoken a lot about the Carocon, the Scandinavians. Today we're going to start playing some Sicilians. Now I'm going to play c5 here. I think the Sicilian is a pretty reasonable choice. I would say that in general, at the absolute beginner level, we're around 700 thus far. Either e5, c5, or c6 are really the only three moves that I see as being acceptable. Now we get the move bishop c4. Now there are many different setups, and one of the setups that I'm going to showcase today is this move e6. Now if my opponent had played the move knight to f3, I was actually intending to play e6 anyway, but it's even better here because after this move bishop c4, when I go pawn to e6, there are no longer any threats towards this pawn on f7 via f3 or h5 here, as this pawn will stand in the way of any threats. So we play the move pawn to e6. Now let's see what our opponent chooses to do here. We get the move knight to f3, and now I'm simply going to play the very calm move knight to c6. Now even without bishop c4, if white had played knight to f3, I still would have done the same thing with e6 and knight c6. We get d4. I will take with the pawn here. Very important to note that in the Sicilian, when you trade pawns on d4, you almost never want to do a double trade where you trade the pawn off and then trade a knight or a bishop, for example, off for the knight. So we trade the pawns off. We're happy with this, and now the move that I'm going to play is this move a6. Now the opening itself is not an opening that necessarily is a beginner opening, but the danger when you play these openings, specifically these systems with e6, is that very easily there's some dark square weaknesses here. If white could get a knight to d6, or say white could get knight b5, my arrows are bad, with the idea of bishop to f4 and then knight c7 or knight d6, again there could be some issues. So the move I'm going to play is a6, stopping any of these knight b5, knight d6, or knight c7 ideas. Additionally, the pawn on e6 also stops knight from going to f5 as well here, so white trades knight. Now in many cases when they're captured, usually it applies to double pawns, but just in general you always want to capture towards the center. Now by the center we're referring to this e file here with all these squares, and the d file as well. Generally both the e and the d files constitute the center. So I could capture away from the center. Where I take with this pawn is towards the edge of the board, towards this side. But what I'm going to do is take with this pawn, and this is capturing towards the center here, towards the e and towards the d file here. This capture will also support the pawn thrust to d5 with both the pawns guarding. So I'm not sure if I explained that super well. Basically the center is the e file or the d file. Everything else you could say, like the f file, maybe it's kind of a bit of the center of the c file, but generally the center is considered to be these two files. So when I capture this way, the pawn is aiming towards the center. It wants to get to the d or the e file here, whereas if I take with this pawn, it would be aiming towards the edge of the board, which would be these three files. So I hope I explained that better. Maybe I didn't. At any rate, you guys will let me know in the comments. So we get the move bishop to e3. Now the move I'm going to play here is d5. Now you'll notice here that I have this nice big set of pawns here. I've got the big black center here, but additionally now I can take and I will develop all my pieces behind this chain of pawns with knight to f6, bishop d6, and castles. Now I am a touch behind in development, so I do have to be a little bit careful here, but this center more than makes up for the lack of development because I'm really only one move behind. I need 1, 2, 3. The king is very safe here behind all these pawns. So without white being able to attack and take advantage of my lack of development, I should be doing very well. So we'll develop the knight here. Really for choice, I could develop the knight, I could develop the bishop, doesn't really matter which one. They're both completely fine. Now I am going to follow this up with bishop to d6 and then castling my king out of the center. We get bishop g5. Now this does temporarily pin the knight, but you'll notice here that there is an imbalance where I have these pawns in the center. Now if white had a pawn on e4, and I'll just pick up this pawn to illustrate, if white could put this pawn on e5 here, for example, this would be a big issue as it would pin the knight and white could win the knight. But here white has no pawn on the e file. There's no pawn available to try and get to this e5 square. So because there's no pawn to get to the square, even though the knight is pinned by the bishop, it's not really that big of a deal. Now there are a couple of options here that I could play. If I were playing a professional game, I would put the bishop on d6, but what I'm going to do is put the bishop on e7 simply to break this pin so that now the knight is free to move and I won't lose my queen. We got bishop a4. I will simply block with the bishop, offering the trade. I will pre-move, queen takes bishop. And now my next idea is to finish development with castles. Now this is a pretty slow game so far. Not a whole lot has happened. What we're about to see is why having the center is a little bit better here for black, because white will be unable to attack the center. And additionally here I have a couple of open files for the rook, very specifically on the C and the B file. Remember, rooks belong on open files. So I'm going to put my rook here, target this pawn on b2. You will also notice that after I put the rook on c8, these pawns in the center are very well guarded. White has this big weakness on c2, and there's just no way to get after the pawns here. So I'm really going to try to put pressure on this pawn on c2. It's not the only pressure point here. This is actually a big mistake, because after takes, white has a huge problem with this rook. It cannot slide over to either b1 or c1 here, so we get to move c3. Now, I'm simply going to look at this position very carefully. Remember, we're out of the opening phase of the game. Now, you'll notice that I can win the pawn here. You might be thinking, well, why take the pawn? White hasn't finished development. Now that would be a valid point. However, usually when you talk about a lack of development and pieces coming into the game, that involves the king specifically being stuck in the center. The king here for white is castled, so if I don't take this pawn, white sooner or later will develop. There's really no big attack here. I don't have to take the pawn, but I am going to capture it in this situation, primarily because it is a free pawn here. Everything is guarded. I'll look closely. King guards the pawns. Rook isn't under attack. This pawn isn't under attack. Everything is safe. So now I have an extra pawn in the center, and I'm going to line up a double or a triple stack and take over the only open file on the board here. You'll notice there are no other completely open files except for this one C file, and luckily my rook and my queen, everything can use it. So we get rook c1. Now here I could play rook c8, but the move that I'm going to play is queen c7, allowing the trade of the rooks. Main reason I'm putting the queen here as opposed to the rook is that after white trades the rooks, that's just a blunder. That's just a free rook. I have 1-2 guarding. Queen's under attack. This will be GG. A little bit premature ending to this game. Not what I was hoping for. I take the queen here. Don't want to have a mouse slip. I will go rook to c8, lining up the double stack, infiltrating with the rook and the queen here. Eventually I'm going to try to checkmate from behind with the queen and the rook, and this looks pretty good for me. You'll also notice that white has no way to create a back rank checkmate here. My king is walled in by the pawns, but this rook cannot get to any of these squares to check the king. So we get the move a4. So now I'm going to go queen g1. I'm going to go after this pawn on g2 and try to end the game as quickly as possible. I will point out, since I do believe the names are blurred on the accounts we're playing, we are very close to a 700 level. Most of these opening videos, I would say for the next 200 points or so, are going to be pretty similar along these lines of of drilling these habits into you about the development, making sure everything is protected, castling your king out of the center. These are going to be the basic principles, in addition to basically focusing on the pawn structure and not getting cheesed at the start of the game. Once we get to about 1000 level, I think it's going to start to change a little bit. Mostly what I'm going to try to do though is showcase some of these different opening setups so you see different strategies and different pawn structures. So my opponent is thinking here and or potentially going to end the game. Very similar to the last video. The last game that I played, my opponent started stalling out towards the end. I don't know if my opponent in this case is doing that, but it is definitely a possibility. Wish I had something instructive to say while we wait, but unfortunately I don't have anything much to say here. Just trying to finish off this game as quickly as possible. I think here I'm going to pre-move rook takes g2. It's not the only move that I can play here, but it seems like a pretty safe pre-move. Let's see what my opponent chooses to do. Try not to turn into a statue here, obviously, for those of you guys who are watching the video. But because my opponent has not made a move, there's just not much more to explain. This could be an issue. I think as we get further into the speed run, this won't be such a big deal. But the second game in a row where this has happened, I don't know if this means my opponent has looked at the account and has seen that this is an authorized speedrun account, or if my opponent is simply just sulking and trying to figure out why he's so outclassed in this game. We might have to sit here for another three and a half minutes. That would be very disappointing if that is the case. It is one thing I would say actually is when you do play online, definitely it's important at least to have some bit Oh, my opponent abandoned the game. This is the second time in a row where this has happened, where my opponent has chosen to disconnect when they've been completely lost. Now, there are a few important points that I want to make about this game. Now, the first one is I don't necessarily recommend this system as a beginner for the reason that I was mentioning during the game, which is say you play a couple of sloppy moves, for example, very quickly after bishop f4. There are all kinds of threats like knight to c7 here, forking the king and the rook, or knight to d6. Say you go something like, I don't know, actually, there's really no good way to stop. Say you play a move like e5 and white goes queen d5 here. There are all kinds of pressure points here. Your king is getting attacked. Everything is loose and you can lose the game. So that's why I played a6 here, because now the knight cannot get to the square. Both these f5 and b5 squares are covered by the two pawns, and so the knight is stuck. So we got this move and I captured towards the center. We got d5. Now, one of the difficulties with an opening like this is that if I were playing a more experienced opponent and they were to put the bishop on d3 and then play something like e5, you'll notice that there's a bit of my pieces are a little bit restricted here. The bishop is inside the pawn chain. So we think about the Caro-Kann, for example, where you get this position d5, just to illustrate it. You get something like this. This bishop is free on the diagonal, or it's free on the diagonal outside of the pawn chain. But here in this position, the bishop is inside the pawn chain. It's not on this diagonal, so the pawn walls in the bishop here. So it's a little bit hard to understand the development. However, people who have played the Caro-Kann should still understand the basic theme, which is to bring the knight here, play c5, building a bit of the center, and then you go for knight c6 to attack the pawn. So we got bishop e3, d5, takes. All this pretty standard. I do want to point out that bishop e7 is not the only move, but in general, if you're faced with a difficult situation where a knight can be pinned, let's just say, for example, white were to have a knight a little bit more in the game here, just to illustrate the point. If white has a knight that were a little bit closer, say his knight were on just making some random moves to show a point, whereas knight we're saying on g3 and there's an idea of a knight h5, or there's something really close to knight. If you have a way of developing with this bishop to break the pin like I did with bishop e7 and then castle, more often than not, I won't say all the time because chess is a game of exceptions, you want to put the bishop here to break the threats of the pin with the bishop aiming towards this queen on the back rank. So that was the second point. And then one last thing I wanted to point out here, because someone probably will wonder about this, is in this position I put the rooks on b8 and c8 to put pressure on these two pawns, but it is worth pointing out that I could also put the rooks on c8 and d8 here, because the rook will always have access on this open file. But if white ever goes c4, I can take, and now this d file opens up, whereas before when I put the rooks on these two squares, if the file ever opens up, just to illustrate the point, I simply have the queen here versus having this rook on this open file and the rook on the c file as well. It would be a much better position if I had the rooks on the two open lanes. All right, so we get a win in the first game, so we'll start our next one. Let's hit the play button, waiting for the pairing, and here we go. We get the white pieces, and I have played a lot of e4 so far, so I'm going to play the move d4. Now, when I play the move d4, I'm going to play the vaunted London system. This is an opening that I think at the beginner level, if you want to try out and you don't want to get cheesed and you just want to get a game with a system, it's a very good opening to play as a pure beginner. Now, the caveat, of course, is that as you improve at chess, I think it's an opening that's a little bit limiting in terms of the pawn structures you get used to and the piece placement as well. So we got the move h6. So now I'm going to go e3. Very logical, just like the last game. I have this pawn chain, but the bishop is outside the chain. The bishop is not on c1, clogged in by the pawn. So now I drop back. I have the three pawns and this bishop on the diagonal. Very, very well placed, versus being here where it would be very passive just to hover over. It would not be very good. So my opponent plays move f5. Now, this is a big mistake. I don't know if my opponent knows what he's doing or not, but I'm just going to punish him because I see no good reason not to. I'm going to go queen h5, checking the king. One of the instructive points about this is that in the opening, you almost never want to push this f pawn, which is right next to your king. It opens up diagonals and all kinds of things can go wrong where you lose the game very quickly. Now, my opponent is on the brink of already losing here. He's going to have to move this king to d7. Maybe it's still not the end of the world, ironically enough, but I'm going to move my knight here, and now I've got this great square for the horse to check the king, and black is in all kinds of trouble. Let's go knight to e5, checking the king. King has to come up. I'm trying to see there's a forced checkmate. I don't see it. I will go check. My queen and my knight guard each other. He's going to move his king over. Now, the move that I think I'm going to play after king to d6 is this move bishop to b5. And the reason I'm going to move the bishop here is that I can always move the knight to check the king, all kinds of fossils. But when I put the bishop here, this simply threatens checkmate, as the king will have no escape square on the c6 square. In fact, I think there might be only one move to stop a forced checkmate here for black, which would be to play the move f4. I think it's the only way, because otherwise knight c4 is going to be an auto checkmate no matter what. We go knight c4, and just like that, boom goes the dynamite. The king has no squares available, specifically c6 and d7, which are covered by this bishop, and that's all she wrote in this game. So let's go for our next one. I think this means we're probably going to get in 2 more games, if possible. That was not really a very instructive game. My opponent lost right away. So let's go back to the Sicilian. So we're going to play the Sicilian here. Now my opponent, I assume, will probably play knight to f3, and again I'm going to play this move pawn to e6. Now I won't always group the videos like this where I try to play the same opening every time, but if I have a situation like this where I've already played e6, there's no reason not to go for it. So my opponent plays move g3. Now this is a pretty serious move actually at the professional level. I'm going to play the move knight to c6, following the standard plan of pushing the pawn and bringing the knight out to start the game. So my opponent plays move knight to c3. Now the move that I'm going to play here is I'm going to play a6 once again. It might not be the best move, but I want to follow the themes of putting these pawns on e6 and a6 and bringing the knight to c6, so you have some basis of consistency to work from. So he goes bishop g2. Now, because my opponent has fianchettoed the bishop to g2 here, the move I'm going to play is b5 with the idea of bishop b7 to try and oppose this bishop on the long diagonal. Now, the reason I go b5 versus b6 here is that if I were to play b6, there's nothing wrong with the fianchetto. But when I go b5, I've taken a little bit more space here. The pawn is 1 square up the board. But additionally, I can also play b4 and attack this knight at some moment down the road. So you go bishop b7, lining up the bishops on the opposite diagonals, and let's see what my opponent chooses to do. Now my opponent plays move d3, and the move that I'm going to play here is the move rook c8. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, what is he doing? He's not following the basics. He's not developing this king side. All these pieces aren't in the game yet. Now this is true, but because the center of the board is closed, you'll notice we have all our pawns, no open files. I'm not super worried about an attack, so I'm going to play the move rook c8 first. Now this is a move that I could wait to play, but the reason I'm going to play is that I expect my opponent to do something with d4 or b4 down the road, try to open up the board, d4 d5 to attack in the center. If white plays d4 b4, the rook on c8 is perfectly placed to play on the c file once it opens up. So we get a3, and now I'm going to play the move knight to f6. Now I will go bishop e7, castle the king, and then we'll see how the game develops. We get rook to e1. Let's go bishop to e7, and I intend to castle on the next turn. Now, I could play the move d6. That would be the best move here in the position to stop white from playing e5, but I want to show you guys the development themes in the opening. I don't want to get too sidetracked, overloading you guys with too many things. Now we get the move d4. Now this is a move that at the beginner level I think is extremely good. My opponent understands he's trying to open up the center of the board. Even if objectively it's not good, this shows good understanding because white has to try and do something here. So I'm going to take the pawn on d4. We're going to get knight takes d4. And everything is kind of guarded here. After knight takes d4, if I take, white takes back. Now remember what I said earlier. I said generally you don't want to trade twice. Now in this case, we're going to hit one of the exceptions. And the reason we're in an exception, or this is an exception, is because when I trade the knights, I have this rook on the file. The rook is on this half open c file. Now by half open, it means there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares that are open. There are 3 pieces on the file, but of course 5 is greater than 3. So more than half of this file is open. Now the reason I'm trading the knights here is because after queen takes knight, I can play this move bishop to c5, kicking the queen out of the center of the board right away. Now without this idea, this maneuver specifically here, I would simply castle the king, following what I said earlier about not doing a double trade. But because it's an exception where I can kick the queen away immediately with this bishop c5 move, there's no reason not to play it. So we're waiting for a move here from my opponent. Let's see what we get in this position. My opponent thus far has played a pretty good game, by the way. I like his understanding. He's showing good understanding up to this point. This is actually, I think, a position where I'm very slightly worse. If I were playing against Magnus, for example, I think I'd be in a touch of trouble. So he goes queen to d1. Now here I'm going to play the move d6, and the reason I'm going to play this move is I'm actually a little bit worried about this e5 pawn push to kick this knight away, and by going d6 I stop this move. e5 I will also just take the bishop and then take the pawn on e5. So I really want to make sure he can't kick this knight. This is a theme that you'll see in a lot of e4 e5 openings, where if your opponent can gain a tempo by attacking a knight, and I will show this after the game, you can end up in dire straits very quickly. So we get e5. So I'll take the bishop. Very important here that one thing that I have mentioned but I did not mention is that, again, one of the basic rules is that you don't want to hang piece. You need to be very careful what's under attack. And with e5, white attacks the knight. Just to go back for a second, white attacks the knight, but white also is attacking the bishop. So if I were to take the pawn here, so the knight's not under attack, then I would lose the bishop, and it would be a typical spaghetti-o moment. Now, this is a big mistake for my opponent, I think, because I can retreat the bishop. And now, even though white is going to win a pawn on g7 here, you'll notice that I have these two Bs that are aimed towards the king. More importantly, white is missing the fianchettoed bishop here. These squares are extremely weak. I will go rook g8, attacking this pawn on g7. Now, because of this open diagonal and white not having a bishop here, I should be able to line up some kind of battery to win the game. So we get bishop h6. Now, you're going to see how quickly this can turn on a dime, because after I go queen to f6, I attack the bishop, but I'm also threatening checkmate in one with queen takes f2. And of course, the pawn on g7 is very weak. So this bishop is going to play a huge role in my eventual victory. So for my opponent here, there really are only two good ways to avoid losing a piece. You drop the bishop back to cut off the checkmate to f2, or playing the move queen d2 would lose to queen f3, I guess, with a double A battery. So bishop e3 is pretty much the only move to not lose the game on the spot. The longer he thinks, the more likely it is that he finds the move. Very good time usage as well, I would say, by my opponent here. Not rushing out. So he plays that move. Very, very good move. And now I'm simply going to take the pawn on g7. Now, I still have this bishop and this queen, which are aiming towards the king here. So I am doing quite well. My opponent will have to come with something pretty good here, I think. He takes, I take back with the pawn. Now, I could have played rook takes bishop, but if I were to take with a rook, I would lose the pawn. I don't want to hang it, so I simply take back with the pawn. So we get knight to e4. Another very good move here is white attacks the queen on f6, but threatens to go knight to d6 as well. In this position, forking the king, the rook, and the bishop. So, of course, I trade the bishop to avoid the fork on d6. Takes back, and now I'm going to grab this pawn on b2 to attack the rook on a1. Now, thus far, my opponent has played an excellent game. He's used his time well. He's probably only marginally worse here, if I'm being honest. I'm not actually sure that I'm even better in this position, but it is tough to play because here I have one extra pawn. Now, the issue for me is that my king on e8, I can't castle the king here, so I'm probably going to have to play it like a bomb cloud with the king on e7. This is not an easy position to play. Now, the reason I'm going to go king e7 here is that white does have a queen on this d file. But because I have the pawn here, white cannot lift a rook. This pawn covers the d4 square. So as long as white can't stack two pieces here to attack on this file, my king should be very safe because there's no entry. Additionally, I can also play rook to d8 with the king guarding my rook. And now I'm going to try to claim the only completely open file on the board. That being, of course, this d file where there are no pawns in the way. Now, the b file is half open here for white if white could put a rook on b1. Also, this e file is half open as well because there are 5 squares on the file. But nonetheless, my king should be safe on e7. So we get rook to b1, another excellent move for my opponent. Now, I can be greedy here with queen takes pawn on a3, but I think it's a little bit... Well, no, I'm going to go for it. I think it's a little bit risky. Actually, queen a3 is a huge mistake by me. It's not a move that I should have played at all. That's actually a big mistake. But let's see what my opponent chooses to do. That's actually a very, very big mistake. Now, assuming that my opponent is playing on his own, I think I'll still be able to get away with it. If not, I'm actually just going to lose this game very, very quickly. But let's see what we get. Now, we get the move rook to e3. Now, my opponent missed a chance to win the game with rook to a1, where you attack the queen and then win the pawn on a6. This will now give me a chance to bring my queen back and cover up my king. Now, if my opponent finds rook to d3, this is also a great move as white lines up a double stack on the file. That would be a great decision, but it's not the only way to play this. Now, I am also picking up the speed as well to try and force my opponent into a situation where he has to move quicker. I'm going to bring my queen to b6. Here I stop any check on b7. And, of course, I threaten to go queen c6, forcing a trade. Because, remember, in this position, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns. My opponent has 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have 2 extra pawns on the queen side in this situation. So if I can force a trade of queens, then I will be doing very well. So I'm going to go queen c6, try to force a trade. My opponent should not trade the queens. If he does, I will simply win the endgame. The move he should play is rook to e4 to prevent the trade. At some point, I probably will start to push the pawns on the queen side here to try to attack. Okay, so my opponent trades the queens. If he had gone rook to e4, it was still playable. But now we're in a situation where I have 2 extra pawns on the queen side. And what I need to do is I need to get these pawns rolling. Now, I could go a5 here, but with this rook on g7 that I don't like, I don't know if it's best, but actually, you know what? I'm going to go for it. Anyway. So we get the move f5. Now I'm going to just keep pushing my pawn with a4. Very important that I pay attention that I don't hang a pawn here on the file. f6 also I can just take. So now I will simply do I take with the rook or the pawn? Now because I have these 3 pawns, I have 1 2 3 4 5 versus 3, and the fact that I have 3 connected pawns going up the queen side here, I'm going to take with the rook because I'm more than happy to trade off the rooks because these pawns are just so fast here. Now my opponent actually can't avoid it. Even if he doesn't take my rook, then I will take his rook. He can't move the rook away without losing the rook behind. So one of the rooks will come off the board, and with these 3 pawns here, this should be a pretty clean victory. Now this is the first game in this entire speedrun that has been actually kind of interesting besides just a basic opening blunder. So a lot of credit goes to my opponent for that. He has actually played pretty well in this game. I found knight to e4, he found bishop to e3, and actually when I played queen takes a3, as I'll show you guys after the game, there was a chance for him to win. Now I could trade the rooks here. I could trade, but the thing is white still can't move the rooks away, so I'm going to trade the rooks anyway. So I will just keep pushing my pawns here. I'm going to go b4 with the idea of a3 and just keep the pawns rolling. Now if my opponent plays rook to a1, then I will obviously trade the rooks off the board, but I'm just delaying as long as I can while improving these pawns and pushing them further up. We get rook to b1. Now following the theme, I will trade the rooks, and here I'm just going to go a3 next move. The pawns are very, very fast here. I have 3 connected pawns. I can even go a2 at some moment. So this should be pretty straightforward here. We get rook to b3. This is actually a mistake because now I can go a2, and the pawn covers the square. This pawn covers the square, meaning that I'm going to be able to queen the pawn on the next turn. So we get the move c3, I queen the pawn, and now it's simply a matter of finishing the game. The move I'm going to play is c4. It's a nasty way of trapping the rook. The queen covers all these squares. The rook can't go to any of these squares. The pawn attacks the rook. The pawn also covers the d3 square. So this rook on b3 is simply going to drop off the board on the next turn. So my opponent resigns. Now my opponent played a very, very good game. If we go back just to show you guys some stuff here, the best move in this position is a move that's a very advanced move, which would be to play the move pawn h5. In case you are an intermediate player and you are wondering, this would be a good move with the idea of knight g4 to hook the knight and attack the pawn. But based on the fact this was a beginner game, I didn't want to go for such a plan, as it would not be in the style of how a beginner would play the game. So to show you guys a specific moment in the game, there's this moment where I played king e7, which was a mistake. What I should have played here was rook to d8, claiming the open lane, and then after white goes queen to e1, then I can play king e7 here because now I control this open file. Doesn't mean it's winning or anything, but black is a little bit better. In the game, however, when I played queen takes a3, my opponent could have won if he had played rook to a1. The queen guards the rook, and now when I move the queen after rook takes a6, there's threats like queen d6. There's a threat of rook to a7. My king is super vulnerable here. In fact, after king to f8, I think after queen d6, king g8, there's something. Is rook takes e6 good? Apparently rook takes e6, rook g6, and black's fine. But even a move like rook c6 here, and white is attacking. If I were to take the rook, there's a very unusual back rank checkmate with queen d8. As my king, there's a rook, not a pawn here, but the king has no squares available anyway, so it gets checkmated, which means I have to move the rook to f8. And after rook takes c5, let's say I go queen b2, white plays something like queen c6. This pawn on b5 is very weak. My king is a little bit weak because I don't have the pawn. I have a rook in front of it. So even though the game goes on, my opponent would have been in great shape to win the game. And we got this rook e3. I went here, and I guess actually the rest of it's pretty straightforward, so there's not a whole lot to explain. But overall, I think this is a pretty good game. This is the first game I played where my opponent actually used his time correctly, didn't make any severe blunders, and it was simply due to skill that I won it. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, which is part of the educational speedrun series on YouTube. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great speedrun videos in the very near future. So I'll see you very soon. Have a good one. Bye.